I would like to move to talking about slavery and film,
Yes.
which is a class you teach, and also you've done scholarship in this area and so forth. I don't quite know how to ask this question, and parts of it are in inverted commas, but and the word good is in inverted commas in this question. What makes a good film about slavery?
That's a good question. I suppose the films that we've seen, there's good in the sense that this allows a lot of discussion. So there are a lot of bad films on slavery that for my class are good because they allow a lot of discourse. The students want to talk because what did I just see? And there's that sense. But as far as a film that I think I would say gets close to getting it right, there are not a whole lot of those, spoiler alert. But I suppose the film that I always tell students, whenever are watching it, that I think came the closest is something like 12 Years a Slave. And it has to do with the film being made in a much more modern era, what they can say in the film that earlier films could not, the subject matter of the film, not focusing on white plantation owners as much as focusing on the life of the enslaved. And so, yeah, I think that's, I guess, what I would consider a good film as far as something on slavery, one that is informative, tries to get at the truth of what slavery was like, and yet is able to translate it for a modern audience, understanding that the medium of film is something simply different than, let's say, a narrative or something. So, yeah.
Yeah, let me ask you about the difference in modes or mediums.
Mm-hmm.
So does it strike you as different or meaningful that we do have these, I think, pretty good literary explorations of slavery? So I'm thinking of Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved.
Right, yeah.
And first of all, so I'm thinking about the sort of the complications or difficulties with adapting that for a visual medium. And second, I'm wondering if there's something about the genre or about the medium, the difference between literature and film, that would help shed some light on what Stephen talked about as the good film. And here I think it's not just good in a kind of objective sense, like this is effective or not effective, but kind of culturally speaking as good or appropriate for that culture, right? Because a lot of the slavery films, point to these kinds of redemptive arcs.
Right.
And it's good in the context. It's normatively good in a cultural context, apart from aesthetic or historical.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In my class, what we teach is a lot of medium theory, right? Which students don't know coming in, but they certainly, when they leave, they're like, oh, wow, now I know a whole lot about political economic theory that I did not want to know about before. But now I tell them, now you can amaze your friends and humble your enemies and ruin everyone else's movie life by pointing out these things. And so we talk about the differences in medium all the time. And certainly, the medium of a film is going to be inherently different than what people can get from a literary medium. So, for instance, you talk about Toni Morrison's Beloved, for instance, which was turned into a film, but that was hard to translate. And it had to do with what the literature itself was trying to do, right? Because here you had a book that was not simply just a straightforward exploration of slavery. It actually takes place after slavery. It's trying to talk about its aftermath and its afterlives. It is very literary in the way that Toni Morrison writes and in the layered construction of it. That can be hard to pull off in a film. I think, as we saw with that film, I think that film made sense to people who'd read the book. And if they had not, they were very lost. Especially, it also gets supernatural. Oh yeah, that's another part it throws in. And so, yeah, I think there are definitively different things that are happening. And I think because of different mediums, I think the creator's trying to do something different with each one. I think there's a way that the way a book is typically read, right? Even the way it's done, you read a bit of a book, you stop, you put it down, you get to think about it. Whereas, and I can talk about things are different now that we have series, right? I'm talking about how that's changed things. But when Beloved came out, we didn't have those. You just went, you had to sit with this thing for 2 hours, take it all in. And I think that just makes it very difficult. And I think that writers and filmmakers, I think, are trying to do two different things in the way they approach their audiences, right? In the way they engage their audiences. And so, yeah, it can be, I think that it's not surprising that literary-wise, we've been able to probably have really more complex explorations about slavery, about the institution, about those who were within it. Whereas with the films, we're kind of stuck in those plantation films for a while because that's what people wanted. And then we had the 80s where we had some weird stuff happening. We had Glory, I think it was about one. And then the 90s, we were just all over the place. And now we're kind of in a space where if you take now from Django to today, where there is a lot of speculative fiction in slavery, like I said, of Django, speculative fiction, even to ideas of horror. And so you see people are still, I think, trying to figure out how to work with it. Perhaps Jordan Peele's Get Out is probably one of the more creative versions of doing that. But yeah, it's still difficult, I think, for the medium of film to approach slavery. Yeah.
So one of the first films that you teach about in your class is Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
And, you know, you raise the question of the medium and the message, and maybe never before have they have they diverged so much. You got a sort of horrifying set of messages, and then for the time, a really sort of spectacular technical, I don't know, achievement, set of innovations and so forth. I mean, how do you teach that film, and how do you wrestle with that?
Well, you know, I teach the film, you know, first of all, we talk when we start off. I show clips from a film, a documentary by Marlon Riggs called Ethnic Notions, and it talks about the history of Black stereotypes in film and relate them to slave era stereotypes, the Mammy, the Sambo. And so it kind of helps us when we get into it. And, you know, we talk about the film. They read things on the Lost Cause and all of that. So when they go into the film, they go into film with a bit of understanding. Right. And then they watch the film, and it's very long. There's a whole first part of Civil War, and then the second part, which most people know, of course, the aftermath of Reconstruction. And so it's a matter of them seeing that film, me debunking the Lost Cause parts, and then asking them, you know, what did you get from this? Why do you think D.W. Griffith did this? So we go into his history. And then we talk about the fact that it was very popular at the time. And why was it so popular? Why did audiences go and see this film over and over again? Why did they see the film and sometimes leave angered, right? Why were people fainting at certain scenes? There's a line from a news article in Florida of a person seeing the film, Florida of all places, seeing the film in 1915, and when they see this white man in blackface chasing this white woman, he pulls out a gun and starts shooting at the screen, according to the news article, right? And so I talk about the impact of medium. And, you know, we argue about these things. Does the medium impact us? Then again, what are we bringing to the medium? When we go through the different theories, right, about that. And I asked them, you know, why did people in 1915, why did they react so much to this film? And I say, let's take it further. Why did white Americans react to this film? Why didn't Black Americans say, like, hey, yeah, you're right. When we see this film, the Klan are the heroes, enslaved people are bad. I said, what are the differences that are going on, and how did this film then create ideas about African Americans to people who may not even have met many African Americans in the Midwest? Why does it help jumpstart the second Klan? Why is it literally the thing that makes the second Klan? Right? And so we go into all of those histories, but it's a good way. It's a good starting point to talk about the history of slavery in film, because what we do in the class is we go from the history of slavery in cinema rather than the history of slavery itself, right? And so if I was teaching a class on slavery, I'd start off with West Africa and the Middle Passage. We don't talk about that until we get to Roots, because that's one of the first films in the 1970s that ever bothers to show the Middle Passage. Nearly all the films before this tend to start out somewhere around the Civil War, right? Because they want it to be somehow about the Civil War and everything. So yeah, so it's an interesting class, and Birth of a Nation really helps kick it off as we go through the different genres.
You know, the other thing that Birth of a Nation does historically is it consecrates this reactionary racial story that had been developing both within and without the American tradition of slavery, right? This is also the time of heightened anxieties about immigration. Yeah. We're right now in the beginnings of World War I, and so there's a lot of anxieties around that. And yeah, I think of an analysis by the late political theorist Michael Rogan on Birth of a Nation. And his argument was that the technical innovation and the racial story actually work together. in that movie, that they should not be understood as sort of, one is amazing technically, the other thing is a aggressive racial story, that in fact the power of both rely upon one another. And so he talks about the famous moment in which Woodrow Wilson is viewing the movie in the basement of the White House, and Wilson's famous quote, of course, is, I'm sure you know, is, "This is like writing history with lightning."
And he's actually quoted in the film. There's a little still of book from Woodrow Wilson in the film.
And of course, Wilson was himself a reactionary historian, one of the first professional historians in the United States, from Johns Hopkins.
Like people, literally the pre-Dunning School in many ways. Yeah.
So that is, I think, a really important part of what film is doing. And so it reminds me of something that you talk about in your Django Unchained article, which I know we'll get to momentarily, but may as well segue there now, I guess. And the way in which film and fiction is the creation, the erection of alternate visions of history.
Yeah.
But those alternate visions of history are just one story alongside official accounts of historical visions. And so I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how you see the role of slavery in particular as essential to particular kinds of national histories, of American national histories, and whether that makes some meaningful difference perhaps in the difficulty that we still have telling sort of accurate and persuasive stories about slavery.
Yeah, I think like I've said often I've said this in the past, I said the reason, there was a time that there weren't that many films on slavery. I'm old enough to remember, like, after Roots came out, like, Hollywood just didn't touch it, right? Television touched it a bit, but Hollywood really did not touch slavery, like from Mandingo, like 1970, just before Roots. Did not touch it again until Glory in 1989, and then wouldn't touch it again pretty much until the Amistad, until Amistad in 1997 with Spielberg. And then we didn't really get this slate of movies on slavery really until Django, 12 Years a Slave in that 2015. So we started getting these we'll start getting a few more now. And so we have a bit more than we've ever had. And then, by the way, it's also tapered off now, right? So they've gone back. They've moved away from it again. And all this to say, I remember when they would come out, it would be like news stories everywhere. Time magazine had something. If I remember Nightline would have a discussion on it in the news. And I would say, one of the reasons I decided to do it, of course, on slavery in the film, I said, something's going on here where there's this topic that we dare not speak about openly because it's too controversial. It makes people uncomfortable. So we've kind of filmed it out to films, right? We've outsourced it. Said, hey, you guys do it, right? You guys do this film. And so when everyone comes up, it would be this huge thing. Like everybody would have to talk about it, right? And then it was like this cathartic release that we could all finally have the discussion about slavery, and then we'd go quiet about it again. And this tells me something about the national understanding of slavery for a very long time as this part of the American story that either had to have some type of redemptive arc, the nation, like even in Glory, see, we got over it, or Amistad, right? There's this weird tagline at the end of Amistad where it kind of, it shows the Civil War, and it was supposed to be see, it was bad, but we fixed it, right? And so the nation is fine. Everything's fine now. And I think there's that need to tell that. There was the need of the American South to figure out how to repackage its own lost cause, the fact that it's lost this war. How do they make it now palatable to everyone else? They come up with this notion, of course, that the war was not about slavery. But then later on, that slavery was fine. Slavery was great, right? And then even there were Black Confederates. The myth making keeps on going. And so I think there's a way that film is often involved in that. I think, as I tend to say, that movies about slavery tend to tell us less about the time period in which the slavery took place, more than they tell us about what we think about it right now and what our society thinks about it right now, right? And so you see Glory, and it comes out at a certain time in 1989 where there's this need to talk about, it's why Denzel Washington, and you can even the storyline is so based on these 1980s and ideas of Blackness. And by the time you get to Django, right, you can have Rick Ross playing in the background, and you have him pulling people off horses because you need this hyper masculine figure, much like you needed in the 60s with Blaxploitation films. And so each iteration is us trying to figure out in our time, how are we going to wrestle with this slavery thing, right? And so when you asked me in the beginning, what's a good film? I thought 12 Years a Slave was the most truthful, right? But you can still see, even in there, right, the director intrudes because he wants to tell a certain story that fits the time period in which the film plays out.
But Tarantino is up to, as I read your scholarship on Django, and also as I view the film myself, like Tarantino is doing something completely different, right? He's sui generis in this sense. Like it's not a worthy film about the historical accuracy of slavery to prompt it. You're like a very special episode, right? To prompt a worthy public debate. It's like just trying to, I mean, it just explodes with kind of,
it's exploitation.
Exactly.
But yet Tarantino takes his exploitation seriously.
Sure.
Right? You know,
because that's his filmic interest.
But he also, this is why I made people got a little controversial that I make like I didn't do it directly in that article. I said, there's a weird similarity here with D.W. Griffith, his belief that his film was going to replace history, right? Because storytelling could tell history better than historians could.
I think you call Django a form of authenticity, more more real than history, or more useful.
That's how
history.
He calls it, right? And he actually does not like roots, right? He actually dislikes roots. He thought it's not real, and he figures his story is go through. And so there's this weird way that, on the one hand, he'll pull back and say, "Look, I'm just doing a movie," but on the other hand, no, I want you to know what I'm doing is better than history, right? This is a more true account, right? This is where he intrudes in that historical space that way, but in a way that it's hard for historians to critique, because at the end of the day, hey, this movie's so absurd, how can we take it seriously? And yet he's letting you know, I want you to take it seriously on this level.
So does he achieve this, in your view?
I think he achieves it with certain people. I think when that film came out, it was not surprising that, well, maybe it was surprising to some that the people that it did very well with were young men of all backgrounds, young white men, young black men. They loved it. It was very hyper masculine. Women barely have roles in that film other than to be rescued. You know, having the hip hop track and everything. Having, I'm blanking on the name of my actor here. Jamie Foxx played the lead role.
Being Jamie Foxx.
Yeah, being basically Jamie Foxx in this film. Everything about it fit with this really, 21st century gritty hip hop notion of masculine blackness and just masculinity. Like, I'm not going to put up with this. And then people like some of the things in there, like the Mandingo fighting, for instance. That became like a huge thing. We're starting to like, that didn't actually exist. Or people insisting, no, I know it had to exist. Right. And people actually saying, you historians are trying to hide the truth from us that Tarantino is telling us. So in his sense, it really worked for people who are yearning to see this kind of thing.
It feels like something Calvin Candy would do.
Right? Exactly. Who wants to see slavery in a very much, here are my villains, here are my good folks, and I want to see this action adventure. And for some people, that worked for them, right? And now it's interesting, by the way, my students now, just to show you how things have changed. I always say, I always try to remind folks how old we are. I said, my students now, when I bring up Hamilton, they're like, oh yeah, that's something my parents watched. Right? I was like, oh my God, to me, that was just the other day. And so, when I show them 12 Years a Slave, it could be that we've come at the tail end of us watching all these other films. There's a lot of eye rolling. And even though some of them say I enjoyed it, they'll say I guiltily enjoyed it because I thought it was absolutely absurd. They don't take any of that stuff as a story. And it's just, that's different from when it first came out. For people who were both watching it as absurdity and liking it, but also thinking, it's telling me something historical here. My students have a different reaction. I'm not certain if that's because they've seen this other films or it's just the time is different, right? A lot of them haven't seen it before. And just that their understanding of the past and their understanding of what is humor is just different. It's like trying to get somebody now to watch Blazing Saddles, right? It worked in the late 1970s. It may not work now.
It's interesting on Tarantino in particular. I wonder if I get the sense that Django has aged differently than Inglourious Bastards, which, as you allude to in your article,
that's a good point,
they do have certain kind of analogic qualities.
Much,
and so I just personally, I think Inglourious Bastards is a significantly stronger and more persuasive kind of alternate history than Django is, although acknowledging all of the sort of the spectacular moments and the really interesting pastiche kind of qualities, I think, of Django that you also bring out. That it's, it's a throwback to the spaghetti Western, but it's also a revenge story. And it's also, there's a kind of a little bit of a hero's journey, kind of
there's a hero's journey
Joseph Campbell sense in there as well. But I wonder if there's something about, first of all, I wonder, do you agree that Inglourious Bastards is sort of working in the same universe?
I think that's his universe. I think it's not surprising that Tarantino likes these, exploitation films, revenge films, some of the best exploitation films. I think he's done it in his older ones, right? There are definitely revenge type films that he talks about. You can go back to, I'm trying to think, Pulp Fiction, right?
Yeah.
By the end is very much a revenge, ideas of vengeance. And so, I definitely think, especially playing around with history the way he does, like, I'm going to have Hitler die in the movie theater, everybody shoots him. This is what I want people to see. And in this one, but it's weird. Something I don't know. He's playing in our faces, like the beginning, having like the enslaved people in Texas. And he says something like, they'll run north. And I'm like, why would you tell any enslaved person to journey north when Mexico's right there in Texas? Like, they have to run through every slave state to get to the north. That seems torturous, telling them to flee to Mexico. And so I sometimes don't know if he's just playing around or if he doesn't know, or if he's really, like you said, like in Inglourious Bastards, I'm purposely tweaking the history. I'm doing what I want.